Henry Knox was born in 1750 in Boston, Massachusetts. Henry was admitted to the Boston Latin School. Since he was the oldest son still at home when his father died, he left school at the age of 12 and became a clerk in a bookstore to support his mother. The shop's owner, Nicholas Bowes, became a surrogate father figure for the boy. However, Henry was also involved in Boston street gangs, becoming one of the toughest fighters in his neighborhood. Impressed by a military demonstration, he joined a local artillery company called The Train at 18. On March 5, 1770, Knox was a witness to the Boston Massacre. According to his affidavit, he attempted to defuse the situation, trying to convince the British soldiers to return to their quarters. He also testified at the trials of the soldiers, in which all but 2 were acquitted. In 1771, he opened his own bookshop, the London Bookstore, in Boston. In 1772, he co-founded the Boston Grenadier Corps as an offshoot of the Train, and served as its second in command. Henry supported the Sons of Liberty, an organization of agitators against what they considered repressive British colonial policies. It is also unknown if he participated in the 1773 Boston Tea Party, but he did serve on guard duty before the incident to make sure no tea was unloaded from the Dartmouth. Henry married Lucy Flocker, the daughter of Boston Loyalists, on June 16, 1774, despite opposition from her father that was due to their differing political views. Lucy's brother served in the British Army, and her family attempted to lure Knox to service there. Since the couple fled Boston in 1775, she remained essentially homeless until the British evacuated the city in March 1776. Even afterwards, she often traveled to visit Knox in the field. Her parents left, never to return, with the British during the withdrawal from Boston after the Continental Army fortified Dorchester Heights. When the war broke out with the battles of Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775, Henry and Lucy snuck out of Boston, and Henry joined the militia army besieging the city. He served under General Artemus Ward, putting his acquired engineering skills to use, developing fortifications around the city. He directed rebel cannon fire at the Battle of Bunker Hill. When General George Washington arrived in July of 1775 to take command of the army, he was impressed by the work Henry had done. Henry did not have a commission in the army, but John Adams in particular worked in the Second Continental Congress to acquire for him a commission as colonel of the Army's artillery regiment. As the siege wore on, the idea arose that cannon recently captured at the fall of Forts Ticonderoga and Crown Point in upstate New York could have a decisive impact on its outcome. Henry is generally credited with suggesting the prospect to Washington, who thereupon put him in charge of an expedition to retrieve them. Reaching Ticonderoga on December 5th, Henry commenced what came to be known as the Noble Train of Artillery, hauling by ox-drawn sleds 60 tons of cannon and other armaments across some 300 miles of ice-covered rivers and snow-draped Berkshire mountains to the Boston siege camps. The region was lightly populated, and Henry had to overcome difficulties hiring personnel and draft animals. On several occasions, cannon crashed through the ice over river crossings, but the detail's men were always able to recover them. In the end, what Henry had expected to take just 2 weeks actually took more than 6, and he was finally able to report the arrival of the weapons train to General Washington on January 27, 1776. Henry's effort is commemorated by a series of plaques making the Henry Knox Trail in New York and Massachusetts. Upon the cannon's arrival in Cambridge, they were immediately deployed to fortify the Dorchester Heights recently taken by General Washington. With the siege ended, Henry undertook the improvement of the defenses in Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New York City in anticipation of British attack there. In New York, he met Alexander Hamilton, commander of the local artillery. The two men formed a close friendship. Henry was with General Washington's army during the New York and New Jersey campaign. He narrowly escaped capture following a British invasion of Manhattan. He was in charge of the logistics in the critical crossing of the Delaware River that preceded the December 26, 1776 Battle of Trenton. Following the battle, he returned the same force, along with hundreds of prisoners, captured supplies, and all the boats back across the river by the afternoon of December 26th. Henry was promoted to brigadier general for his accomplishment, and given command of an artillery corps expanded to 5 regiments. The army again crossed the river a few days later after the decision to make a stand at Trenton. Henry was with the army at the January 2nd, 1777 Battle of Assunpink Creek, and again the next day at Princeton. In 1777, while the army was in winter quarters at Morristown, New Jersey, Henry returned to Massachusetts to improve the army's artillery manufacturing capability. He raised an additional battalion of artillerymen and established an armory at Springfield, Massachusetts, before returning to the main army in the spring. Henry returned to the main army for the 1777 campaign. Henry was present at Brandywine, the first major battle of the Philadelphia campaign, and at Germantown. At Germantown, he made a critical suggestion approved by General Washington to capture rather than bypass the Chew House, a stone mansion that the British had occupied as a strong defensive position. This turned out to significantly delay the army's advance and gave the British an opportunity to reform their lines. Knox was also present at the Battle of Monmouth in July 1778, where General Washington commended him for the artillery's performance. The army then saw no further action that year. Henry and the artillery established a winter cantonment at Plaquemine, a hamlet of Bedminster, New Jersey. There, Henry established the Continental Army's first school of artillery and officer training. This facility is considered the precursor to the United States Military Academy at West Point, New York. In late September 1780, Henry was a member of the court-martial that convicted Major John André, the British officer whose arrest exposed the treachery of Benedict Arnold. During these years of relative inaction, Henry made several trips to the northern states as General Washington's representative to increase the flow of men and supplies to the army. In 1781, Henry accompanied General Washington's army south to participate in the decisive siege of Yorktown. He was personally active in the field, directing the placement and aiming of the artillery. General Washington specifically called out both Henry and the French artillery chief for their roles in the siege and recommended to Congress that Henry be promoted. Henry Knox was then promoted to Major General on March 22, 1782. At the age of 32, he became the Army's youngest Major General. He and Congressman Gouverneur Morris were assigned to negotiate prisoner exchanges with the British. These negotiations failed because the sides could not agree on processes and terms for matching various classes of captives. He joined the main army at Newburgh, New York, and inspected the facilities at West Point, considered a crucial defensive position. General Washington appointed him its commander in August of 1782. The next month, he was devastated by the death of his 9-month-old son, and he fell into a depression. He soldiered on, however, becoming involved in negotiations with the Secretary at War, Benjamin Lincoln, over the issue of pensions and overdue compensation for the military. With the arrival of news of a preliminary peace in April 1783, Congress began to order the demobilization of the army, and General Washington gave Henry Knox day-to-day command of what remained of the army. During this time, Henry organized the Society of the Cincinnati, a hereditary fraternity of Revolutionary War officers that survives to this day. He also drafted plans for the establishment of a peacetime army. Many of those provisions were eventually implemented. These plans included 2 military academies, 1 naval and 1 army. When the British withdrew the last of their troops from New York on November 21, 1781, Henry was at the head of the American forces that took over. He stood next to General Washington during the latter's farewell address on December 4th at Fraunces Tavern. After General Washington retired, Henry became the senior officer of the army. The post of Secretary at War became available when Benjamin Lincoln resigned in November 1783, and Benjamin Lincoln had recommended Henry to follow him. Henry Knox resigned his army commission in early 1784. Henry returned to Massachusetts, where the family established a home at Dorchester. He was able to assemble a vast multi-million-acre real estate empire in Maine, including almost all of the old Flucker holdings. Congress finally appointed Henry the nation's second Secretary of War on March 8, 1785. At the time, Henry is reported to have been of immense girth, weighing nearly 300 pounds and 6 foot 3 inches tall. The army was by then a fraction of its former size, and the new nation's westward expansion was exacerbating frontier conflicts with Aboriginal tribes. The War Department Henry took over had 2 civilian employees and a single small regiment. Congress in 1785 authorized the establishment of a 700-man army. Henry was only able to recruit 6 of the authorized 10 companies, which were stationed on the western frontier. The need for an enhanced military role took on some urgency in 1786 when Shays' Rebellion broke out in Massachusetts, threatening the Springfield Armory. Henry personally went to Springfield to see to its defense. In the rebellion's aftermath, Congress called what became known as the Constitutional Convention. With the adoption of the new Constitution and the establishment of the War Department, Henry's title changed to Secretary of War. As part of his duties as Secretary of War, Henry was responsible for implementation of a Militia Act in 1792. This included his evaluation of the arms and readiness of the militia, finding that only 20% of the 450,000 members of the militia were actually capable of arming themselves at their own expenses for militia service as required by the Act. To resolve this arms shortage, Henry recommended to Congress that the federal government increase the purchase of imported weapons, ban the export of domestically produced weapons, and establish facilities for the domestic production and stockpiling of weapons. These facilities included the existing Springfield Armory and another at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. In 1792, Congress, acting on the detailed proposal from Henry, created the short-lived Legion of the United States. When the French Revolutionary Wars broke out in 1793, American merchant shipping began to be affected after President Washington formally declared neutrality in the conflict. Both France and Britain began interfering with American shipping. Henry urged and presided over the creation of a regular United States Navy and the establishment of a series of coastal fortifications. Henry was responsible for managing the nation's relations with the Aboriginal residents in lands it claimed. Following a 1789 act of U.S. Congress, Henry stated that the Aboriginal nations were sovereign and possessed the land they occupied, and that the federal government should therefore be responsible for dealing with them. These policies were implemented in part by the passage of the Indian Trade and Intercourse Act of 1790, which forbade the sale of Aboriginal lands except in connection with a treaty with the federal government. Henry Knox wrote, "The Indians, being the prior occupants, possess the right to the soil. It cannot be taken from them except by their consent or by rights of conquest in case of a just war. To dispossess them on any other principle would be a great violation of the fundamental laws of nature." American Indian Wars, including the Cherokee American Wars and the Northwest Indian War, would occupy much of his tenure. During the years of the Confederation, the British supported the northwestern tribes from their frontier bases that they had continued to occupy after the Revolutionary War ended, and the Cherokee and Creek continued to contest illegal encroachment of colonial settlers on their lands. In October 1790, Henry organized a campaign led by General Josiah Harmon into the Northwest Territory in retaliation for Aboriginal raids against colonial settlers in that territory and that of present-day Kentucky. The campaign failed. A second campaign, however, was organized by Henry and to be led by Territorial Governor Arthur St. Clair, which became the American Army's greatest defeat in history. These campaigns failed to pacify the Aboriginals, and Henry Knox was widely blamed for the failure to protect the frontier. Seeking to close the issue before he left office, he organized an expedition led by Anthony Wayne that brought the conflict to a meaningful end with the 1794 Battle of Fallen Timbers. Anthony Wayne's troops had burned immense fields of corn for a stretch of about 50 miles along the river, in a move that affected civilians. The result of American military action in the Northwest led to the Treaty of Greenfield, which forced the natives to cede lands to the Ohio area. The Aboriginal nations refused to be removed from their lands without a fight, and they opposed the Americans' attempt to forcefully remove them in warfare, by trickery, or by treaties, since they had owned and lived the lands for thousands of years. After failing to appease the Cherokee and Creek with a large cache of gifts in 1789, Henry eventually signed the Treaty of New York on behalf of the nation in 1790, ending conflict with some, but not all, of the Cherokee tribe units. President Washington's policies, as carried out by Secretary Knox, set the stage for the rise of Tecumseh. Many thousands of Aboriginals refused to accept treaties, claiming that they had not approved them and that their only purpose was to remove them from their land. They specifically cited the Treaty of Greenville and reoccupied ancestral lands, beginning renewed resistance in the Northwest that was finally crushed in the War of 1812. On January 2nd, 1795, Henry Knox left the government and returned to his home at Thomastown to devote himself to caring for his growing family. He was succeeded in the post of Secretary of War by Timothy Pickering. Henry Knox built a magnificent 3-story mansion surrounded by outbuildings said to be unequaled in the Commonwealth. He spent the rest of his life engaged in cattle farming, shipbuilding, brick making, and real estate speculation. In 1806, while visiting a close friend, Henry Knox swallowed a chicken bone, which lodged in his throat and became infected. He died at home 3 days later, on October 25, 1806. He was buried on his estate at Thomaston with full military honors. 2 forts, one in Kentucky and one in Maine, were named after him.